Right, well, we're here in East London on a cold and breezy morning. Richard Conway, Andy Cross, CEO and founder of Elastacloud, and me. I started at Microsoft, 1996 in the developer customer unit. We met in 2010, 2011, something like that. And here we are. We thought we'd sort of get together and think about some of the stories and things that happened and what's got Elastacloud, to where it is. And, we were just sort of chatting before we started, weren't we, about how this Elastacloud thing happened and how you two came together. Richard, first of all, why did you two get together? How did you two get together?
So I think I did a bit of work with AWS. Sacrilege, yes. Already I started up this one. Speechless. Yeah. But it was the only thing available at the time, and I kind of got a taste for it, and not a lot of people were using it, and you had to come up with really innovative ways just to use it through your browser because it broke all the time. And then, but I was a Microsoft person through and through, so it just allowed me to write C# code somewhere else.
Yeah.
But I saw Azure released 2008. I got really excited, but not many other people were, and nobody was really talking about it. And so I started blogging. I used to have this alias then. It was a bit of a crappy alias, really, but
what was it?
𝗧𝗵𝗲
Come on.
Right.
Good. You sure he wasn't on a CB or something?
No, nothing like that. But Andy had a blog as well, and we kind of met through the blogosphere because it was the thing then, to have a blog spot or something like that.
And did you sort of did it, virtually for years before you actually met in people? It's not a new thing, that phenomena.
Yeah, I mean, and the sort of social media back then for this Azure community was on the Microsoft TechNet forums, and people coming on asking questions about why is it all broken today. And Richard and I would sort of be some of those people, very small community of people who actually tried to answer some of those questions. And it's actually quite amazing the number of people who were in that small clique of people trying to help, who went on to then join Microsoft and then go on a journey with Azure going forward.
But so that's when you met and how you met. But what was the beginning of your interest in computing? I mean, we were chatting beforehand. You were saying back in when you were very young, you were doing web stuff.
Yeah.
What got you into tech in the first place?
For me, I think I've always been interested in sci-fi, the future, and things like that. Like so many of people in our sector, and looking at how the future can be. And we grew up in this amazing time where the world has fundamentally changed, and the driving force for change has been technology. And in recent years, maybe there's a lot more controversy around how it's permeated society and the impacts that it's had on that. But actually, in the most part, it's been a force for good. And standing back and looking at the world as a child and coming from a place that was a little bit underprivileged in north of England, and looking at the sort of jobs that were available, if I didn't want to follow my dad into like military aircraft manufacturer is what he was doing, I would effectively be pretty much out of luck in that area. So doing something in technology meant that my skills were now relevant globally, and were doing things that were changing the world all over the place. And I was a teenager in the 1990s, and that was when the web took off. And before that, there was no broad access to information that was simple and ubiquitous and global. And writing websites was a way to be a creator in a way that allowed everyone to share and benefit from each other's knowledge. And web and web tech then became this thing which was a real manifestation of this change for good, for creating a new world that was more like the sci-fi that I was watching on TV than the sort of bit of a nightmare, dystopian nightmare that I saw on the streets of the north of England. So to try and look at, how do I get a future where, I can do better things, I can actually, use tech and do what I really like to do. It was always going to be for me web tech. So I went quite deep on web tech, and I'm still. This morning before I came here, I was writing TypeScript and JavaScript, and I still get my hands really, really dirty with that stuff, and nothing makes me happier than writing code, particularly web code. And that makes me sound pretty sad. Sorry about that. But it really does. Don't think about that, Andy. But going through that process took me from doing web in my bedroom as a kid, doing web at university through a computer science course, to getting jobs in London around e-commerce, really. And for me, getting into the cloud was looking at e-commerce and seeing how retailers, e-com retailers like Asos would have these crazy problems around Christmas time, where the servers would always break. They always go offline because people wanted to go online and get themselves a pair of shoes or whatever for Christmas, and the website would crash because too many people had the same idea, and the whole thing came down. And that's then a problem of scale, and that's what the cloud was invented to solve: problems of elastic scale and bursty compute. Elastic scale and elastic cloud is kind of where we went with the whole name Elastacloud, and that's our view on what the cloud's for. It's not just using someone else's servers in the same old way. It's doing something innovative with a new paradigm of compute around bursty, at scale, mass computation, and elastic cloud.
Well, there's a lot in there. Let's come back to some of that. You make me think of so many things I could jump onto. But Richard, the same question to you. Sort of what got you into tech? Let's go back to the childhood. Who was the young man that emerged into this man we see before us today?
Yeah, so I think maybe kind of similar family push as Andy had, but I was slightly different age. I think we're probably 8 years apart or something, right? So web wasn't really a thing when I was growing up, and when I was I must have been about 7 or 8, and my dad came home with a ZX81, and I remember
so many of these conversations begin that way, don't they?
I know. Do you know what? I looked on eBay the other day, right? I wish he'd come home with a ZX80 the year before, because they're worth an absolute fortune now.
Are they?
Yeah. No one had a ZX80. Everyone had a ZX81, so you couldn't, I think they're worth about 500 or 600 quid.
My dad came home with a fax machine in his car. And it was like he worked for Scotland Yard and in the communications division, and he came home with this Ford Anglia or whatever it was, and there was a fax machine in the dashboard. It just blew my mind. I didn't know what a fax machine was, why it would be in a car. But anyway, back to the ZX81.
It is incredible though, like the age of the car phone. I remember my mom came in one day
this
carrying
is long
a brick
before
of a battery.
that.
That's right. I wonder how many of those batteries it would take to run a Tesla these days.
Yeah,
quite a few.
So he brings it back, and your eyes light up.
Yeah. So obviously I didn't know what it was, but he plugged this in. We had a black and white screen, and I saw him open up the manual and start typing, and and in the end he got bored. Right, there were too many syntax errors, and he'd been he was a hardware engineer, so he worked on military stuff for aircraft, international friend or foe, and through Plessy Corp. And he'd done a little bit of software, but he wasn't very fluid with it. And so I remember reading this manual at age 7, learning pretty much in an evening all about control structures and printing stuff on the screen, and then I just threw it away and started doing my own thing. And then before I knew it, I was Mum was getting me magazines from the newsagent, and I started writing games. And then as the technology progressed, and as I went through school, I got really excited with the BBC B revolution, and I managed to set up my first network in a school, Token Ring, hideous network design. But it was really that kind of emergent phase of the internet, and because I always try and do the opposite to what everybody else does, I was always spending my lunch times instead of smoking in the fields or whatever
everybody else was doing.
I was sitting in the computer lab, understanding how file servers work, understand how networks work. I got really engaged with bulletin boards.
I thought that's where you were going to start. You met on a bulletin board, but slightly later.
I wish it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But we could have actually bumped into each other on IRC, on Internet Relay Chat, because after the bulletin boards, I spent a lot of time there. But I was always engaged with like hacker communities and, you know, that sort of fringe 2600 culture. I loved all that. And so I just hung out with people who just had exactly the same interests, and we just kind of fed off of each other.
Yeah.
And then, you know, into my career, I lost track of it wasn't really an interest point for me, the security side and hacking, but I just got incredibly interested in cryptography. I read everything that Bruce Schneier had written. I took all of the algorithms that he'd built around blowfish and twofish, and I started writing them myself, porting them from C. Some of them I moved to C# when .NET had released, and you know, I just wanted to be an expert in something. So I was always kind of pushing the bounds of that side, like really understanding all these distributed security protocols, and it led me into that whole Microsoft world of Microsoft Passport and all of the other early authentication schemes, and
Hailstorm and all these sort of things.
I was totally embedded in Hailstorm. I absolutely loved it. .NET My Services, and you know, I mean, at the time I thought that all of that was going to be the future, right?
Sure.
And I mean, in large part, it was well ahead of its time.
Well ahead of its, I mean, they talked
visionary.
about the fabric and all this sort of stuff. Didn't they? You know, Gates was talking about that, which, you know, Andy Smith and people are still talking about now, aren't
That's
they?
right.
You know, so yeah.
I mean, it's basically what we have. And then, you know, when Azure was released, it was called the Azure Fabric. You know, led on to services like the Service Fabric, which are the backbone of Azure. So, I really do think, like you say, you know, these key individuals like Bill Gates, you know, they can see what's on the horizon before it's on the horizon.
Yeah,
you know?
it's just a question of getting to it, isn't it? And things get confused along the way. I mean, as you were talking about the school and your first exposure to PCs, etc. A friend of mine just a few years ago went to the school, and they were doing the tour, and they said, that's where we keep the PC. And he thought, God, you know, this is years later. They've only got one PC. Apparently, it was the police constable. But you know, so things change, words morph. So I was thinking as you were talking earlier on about Christmas and Asos, because I remember in ADCU, which was the application developer customer unit at Microsoft, which was the forerunner to all the developer groups. We did a thing called eChristmas, which was exactly based on what you're talking about, a guy, Andy Matson, I don't know if you remember him. But of course, e-commerce was invented, so he tells us, by Nick Ogden. Nick Ogden, you know, Clearbank, and you know, that's a good mutual set of contacts, Andy Smith, etc. with us there. But the story there, I don't know if you know, and it'd be interesting to see how it develops for Asos, but he was in Jersey, and he was running some sort of little internet service provision piece, and they put up a web page, and they did some work with Barclays called Barclays Square, and I'll probably get this story completely wrong, but it was along these lines. But what happened was, unfortunately, Princess Diana died. Barclays Square was the only e-commerce site around at the time, so they wanted to use that to get donations, and so suddenly everybody was from all around the world doing all of these donations in all these multiple currencies and prices and so forth. And of course, they hadn't got any way of thinking about that. They were just in England as far as they were concerned. And that was for him the beginning of sort of, you know, understanding e-commerce, not just scale, but scale and currency and language and all these things. Did you go on this journey as well? Not just the developer code journey, but all of the business logistics and multilingual logistics?
Yeah, absolutely. So the good thing that I experienced at Asos in that major project that I was running over there was around internationalisation. It was an international project going from ASOS.com, which was actually should have been .co.uk really, it's a UK oriented site, to one which was in France and Italy and Germany and Spain. And there was some really interesting things which really opened my eyes actually to how things work differently in places, and how in our sometimes blinkered views around how we write code for our society, for the thing that we experience day to day, it can be very inaccurate actually. Our views on how we should do things is something which can be fundamentally wrong. So as an example, a very simple example will actually be that Thanksgiving is a bigger day than Christmas in the US. So if you're targeting a US site, you don't need to worry about scale at Christmas. You need to worry about scale around Thanksgiving. So that sort of thing applies. But in our crazy continent of Europe, it's a lot more bizarre. So there are different feast days across Europe, and there are different ways of paying. And I remember when we were going into the French market, I think it was the French market. Anyone French could apologize if I get this wrong. But a common way of paying in about 2010, 11, maybe, something like that, just before I came to Elastacloud, I was at Asos running this international project. A common way of paying was your delivery driver turns up at your house with your Asos parcel, and he comes and knocks on your door, and you answer your door, and before he gives you the parcel, he says, "Can you pay me, please?" Mm-hmm. So you have to pay for your Asos parcel to someone who's like a delivery driver who doesn't work for Asos. You have to just tap your card, pay with your card machine, sign away, and then they'll leave your parcel, and then you'll go back to his van. And sometimes he won't be able to connect to the internet with his phone or whatever because it's in the middle of nowhere. So Asos would have to have a whole new state of delivered but not paid for, that they would have to then have a whole new set of systems for tracking down the people who had effectively stolen from them, because perhaps the transaction didn't go through because of no internet, but when it did go through, there was no money in that bank account.
So it kind of like the forerunners of Klarna then.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, the ability to sort of try and figure that out and have a whole new set of payment systems was definitely something which was a massive challenge. But the thing where the cloud started to help, firstly, there was what is really important about the cloud is it should put tools closer to developers for deploying software and getting software into the world, in front of customers more rapidly. So it should be bringing down walls. It shouldn't be adding extra steps. So that means you can innovate faster, you can push your software out better, you can treat everything at endpoint as an API. So I ask it for a server, it gives me a server. I don't have to phone up a manufacturer and worry about someone putting a power cable in the back or whatever. I don't have to worry about any of that. So I should be able to push code out more rapidly. I should also be able to scale it up and down however I like. And so when you look at certain days, feast days or whatever that are happening around Europe, the spikiness of compute is just really unusual. If you were to sort of sit there as a Northern Englishman like I am and go, when is it likely to be busy? Sort of Christmas time, maybe a little bit around Easter, and then a few little spikes through the year for summer holidays and stuff like that, but pretty much nothing else. Very sort of simple pattern. If you overlay that with the same type of thinking from France and Germany and Spain and Italy, you just get this really, really, really spiky pattern. And as we were pushing out into the international market with that e-commerce proposition, the usefulness of the cloud became apparent really, really immediately. That what we can do is just not worry about the fact that tomorrow is a feast day in a certain country, so we have to turn on another server. That's just madness, right? And that's the thinking that was happening in 2010. But by 2012, we were already at a point where that's not good enough thinking. We can't know which servers to turn on, which servers to turn off. We can't even build a sort of virtualized environment effectively enough to be able to deploy things into the right regions. We have to use something which is reactive to change as change happens. So as people wake up one day and go, oh, I need to buy something for Christmas, or I need to buy something for St. Andy's Day. That's not a day. It shouldn't be a day. But I have to buy a present for someone, and everyone in a locale thinks the same thing. You don't actually have to necessarily get ahead of that spike in load. You can just watch the spike come up and just put more stuff on the cloud to cater for that traffic.
So you had that, it's interesting because some of these things are sort of semi-iterative, aren't they, really? You see that little story that I gave, and then obviously, he went on to form WorldPay and then, ClearBank and all the rest of it. And you can see the problem statements he's identified in each iteration, which has led him forward. I'm thinking, seeing this at Asos, getting that lesson that you've just described about, the elasticity of the cloud. Yeah. And then you've gone, great, let's put together Elastacloud to do this for everyone else. Was it as simple as that? Or Richard, how did the genesis, you said how you met, but what led you to form Elastacloud and do what Elastacloud does?
So at the time, there were literally only a few people using Azure. And most of us were hobbyists because there weren't really any jobs. I think Microsoft were maybe 18 months into their Azure journey, and it was pretty unusable. And you probably want to edit that bit out.
Well, I think everyone knows that, right? It's come back and got rewritten, didn't it? So
yeah, that's right. And I mean, there were all these stories that you'd hear that Scott Guthrie did a complete shake up and took, like entire teams away and said, this is just not good enough, right? And just started really pulling Azure up by the bootstraps and getting new people in, and that's when it started to accelerate. I think for us, we were in contact, and every time I think I had a lead on a job, and I only wanted to work part-time at the time, and Andy wanted a little bit more work. Mm-hmm. And I think there were only a few things that you could do to get paid. One of them was, which I was doing because it just suited the time that I wanted to spend working, was MSDN discovery packs. Mm. And so what Microsoft would do is, if you had an MSDN license, right, to force you to use Azure, they'd send somebody like me to teach you how to use Azure, and they'd give you, I can't remember how much it cost, but they gave you more Azure credit than you actually paid for the licensing, mm-hmm. Which was the encouragement, loss leader. So I remember I was going all around the country doing this kind of work, working for different gold partners who just didn't have any capability. And I think maybe I told you about that job that you ended up doing, which was in one of the insurance companies, and then working through a gold partner. And then we both talked about how rubbish the gold partners of the age were. We then did some work together at it was a post-sales support role for Microsoft, again through a third-party company. I think we both lasted about 3 or 4 months there, and it was just absolutely terrible. There was nobody really using Azure, and anybody that called up with issues that we had to fix, they were just stupid issues. Yeah. So we just thought, we can do this better, and
was it true? The sort of the rewrite of history within Microsoft was, we were too futuristic too fast. We went out with PaaS. And nobody was ready for PaaS. They wanted IaaS because they were crawling out of the sort of primordial soup of servers on-prem kind of thing. And so we had to go back to IaaS to catch up with AWS. Was there any truth of that in your journey? Interesting.
I think it was a problem with developers. I think that they were the issue. I don't particularly. I mean, even now when I look at AWS and Google platforms, right, some of them are utterly atrocious, right? And they're not designed properly because they're designed by developer architects who want to reinvent the wheel and do everything themselves. I think Microsoft created a really simple framework in the early days. It's got much more complicated now with a lot more services, but you could deploy websites at scale, you could deploy back-end services at scale, you had messaging to do, and you weren't conflicted over what to choose because there are only a few building blocks, right? And if you knew how to put everything together, right, you could end up with a system to do everything probably in half the time of what you could do today, right? Today, people are so spoilt for choice with the things that they can do, right? They'll literally spend months and months trying to work out which way to go because there's probably 8 different permutations for how they can build their platform. So I think it was a much simpler time, right? I'm not going to go into the old times, but it was. I think seeing the cloud evolve the way it has been quite difficult for people like me and Andy, where things were getting done in a much better and clearer way at the start because you had all the constraints. Now it's no holds barred. Anybody can do what they want. And they can build bad platforms. Yeah. Back then you couldn't. You basically weren't smart enough to do anything at all, or you could do it the right way.
Yeah. I mean, this is the nature of choice, unfortunately, isn't it, really? That you open up the choice public, private, proprietary, open, free, commercial, they're all important and there's a role for them, but it does create a lot of choice. And then within choice then becomes, I think Brad Smith's book, Weapon and Tools, right? It can be, and it can be done badly. But, you've got a reputation now, obviously, as a firm where you are, you're the sort of SAS of cloud and data science, if you like. You're not the infantry, which kind of maybe you're referring to there, and you've got that from being doing the hard yards. You've been there, you've done it, you've put the skin in the game. When you look now at maybe new people coming into the business with all that choice that you've just described, what would you recommend they do to actually kind of learn the craft, if you will? I'm just leaping on a bit, but I'm just thinking about what do you need to do to get to, if they want to be you in a few years' time with all that experience and the scars of experience?
I think just keep it real. I think, sorry, I sound like a gangster there, but it is, you just need to keep writing code, right? And you need to keep innovating outside of your day-to-day role. When we were learning through pushing the boundaries, right? And if you know how a thing works, right, then it doesn't fundamentally matter whether Microsoft replaces Azure Batch with Azure Functions, right? It's just another building block, and it takes you a day to pick up. And it's the same with people that learn programming languages, right? People that learn programming languages will see all of the small similarities, even between languages like COBOL and C++. Right, and be able to utilize those connections to learn new languages. So I think it's all about exposure. It's all about just rinse and repeat and just building new stuff. And it reminds me of this project that Andy and I did. Actually, in Andy's garden shed, wasn't it? It was
either a garage or a garden shed, isn't it?
It was a nice shed. I put a floor in it and everything.
That's right. That was where you were relegated.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Thrown out of the house.
Thrown out of the house. So we, one of the things that we wanted to do at the time was to automate Azure, and now it's a really easy activity. There's all these different interfaces from command line to the Azure portal, but back then you couldn't really do very much. The evangelist team in the US. Released something called 𝗬𝗵 commandlets, which were PowerShell.
Right. That one passed me by.
That's probably a good thing. So these commandlets were okay. They put everything in the frame of Microsoft's classification of an IT pro. They were. You probably remember in the early years, right? Everybody was.
Sadly, I was running developer marketing for a while, so I probably was part of the thought police that came up with this nonsense.
Right. Yeah. You were either developer or IT pro. You're in one of the two camps, and I think at either times of the cycle, right, you felt like one of the underappreciated side. So at the time, the developer audience, which I think literally was us. It was like me, Andy, and about 3 other people that were using Azure, decided that we wanted a C# SDK for this. And there was nothing that Microsoft was producing. They weren't putting out samples. They weren't putting out anything. So we decided to reverse engineer all of Azure, which is what we were doing all along. And so I remember in the early days, we built a capability so that we could drive everything from C# for web roles, worker roles, queues. We reverse engineered storage accounts. And we started getting all this momentum. Like, people were contacting us from China and all these other places and going, "Oh, I really like your software. I've just installed it and consumed it in NuGet. Can you do this with it?" And then we'd start adding the odd feature here and there. But the numbers were just driving up from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands. And it was like, oh, God, we've obviously hit on something. And then we carried on supporting this. And in 2012, we invited Scott Guthrie over. And it was hugely amazing time for us because he's obviously a legend. And he brought his evangelist team. At the time we were running the UK Azure user group, we set up a conference and for him to speak at, and they'd release all of these new things. So all the IaaS you were talking about with virtual machines, they'd released a new bunch of PaaS services in Azure Web Apps. And the first thing that I was thinking was, right, we need to like extend what we've done and automate all of this so that you can have one C# command, and then within a few minutes you've got your web app or you've got your virtual machine. And we started doing this, and it was fine for some services, but creating these what were called at the time persistent virtual machines, because you had persistent storage with them, it was just an impossible task. Like every time we would try and reverse engineer this, it would break. And we delved into some of the payloads and the APIs, documentation. Of course, in classic style, most of it was wrong. We reverse engineered a lot of what we could see when we created this through the web. And I remember sitting for 6 hours in Andy's shed going, there's something a little bit funky about the way that Microsoft are doing this. And we realized that even though XML, which was the way that you had to create these things, it's an encoding format, it's supposed to be non-order dependent. Oh, yeah. Microsoft had actually written this so that it was order dependent, which I think was probably a bug, not a feature. And it taken us about 6 hours to unwind this. So we reached out to them and said, I think you probably want to make this not order agnostic because that's not how XML works.
Yeah.
And then we wrote this. We wrote the SDK. We wrote the library for this, and our user base went up even further because everybody wanted to use virtual machines. And eventually, it caught up with Microsoft, and we had these amazing people in the evangelist team, like Brady Gaster, come to us going, "What you guys have done is just fantastic, right? We want to write our own Fluent SDK, and we've taken all this inspiration from you." And that was really the start of the whole C# automation within Azure. And yeah. I mean, the Microsoft guys gave us all the credit for it, which was fantastic. But
and you were eventually able to burst out of the shed then, were you?
Yeah, eventually.
And you were saying, I mean, there are a lot of these sort of projects. You were talking about the Guinness Records thing earlier on. Yeah. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so it was a good opportunity. We were working closely with the Microsoft guys, the developer team, and what they're trying to do was prove out that Azure can scale a long way and be performant. And they've done a few various different things in the past, but it's always a bit boring if what you're trying to do is like show that you can process lots of bank transactions or something behind the scenes. It's like it doesn't really get people's interests up. And so you're looking for something a little bit interesting, a little bit out there, to see what the developer community in the UK was doing and see what Microsoft could do to support that and help it go to the next level. And they happened to get in touch, or I don't know how it happened, but they started working with a games company, a UK games company, Illyriad Games, they're called. Some really, really, really smart people working there. And what they were building was a web-based 3D space shooter where you like run around in a little fighter jet sort of thing, but in space and shoot everybody else up. And it was a multiplayer experience. And the thing that was really particularly interesting was that they were trying to build it all on Azure and try and build it in a way where you can have thousands and thousands of people in the same level at the same time, like massively multiplayer, but not segregated out into people are in this dungeon and people are in that dungeon. They're on separate computers for the server side. They had to be sort of together, able to play and interact with each other together in the space. So to do that, they had an Azure backbone, and Microsoft had helped try and rationalize it a little bit and put some money in a little pot so that they could do a really big play test. And they got the Guinness Book of Records involved to try and become the biggest... what was it? How was it exactly sold? It was the biggest concurrent game within a single level, multiplayer game in a single level.
And it was, I think EVE Online had the record, which was about 5,500 users.
Yeah, that's right. And so we started playing this game, and it was amazing how it worked. You know, we got to see all the back ends. Richard and I were invited as the Guinness Records expert witnesses. So that
did you have to wear a little blue suit with a white trim? Or?
No, there was another dude who did have that actually, but
and a clipboard.
And he was a great guy actually. Yeah. Lots of interesting stories. But no, we were there just to. He came to us and go, "Did they cheat?" And we went, "No." So that was our job for the day. It was like say no, but we did, because we obviously there was a lot of credibility on stake. Guinness wouldn't just say yes that it happened.
For sure.
So they wanted people who knew what they were doing to actually go and check that everything was happening. So we were looking at all the logs and all that sort of stuff that was happening in real time and see what the scaling units were, watching people playing and all kinds of interesting stuff like that. And it was just this fabulous experience where thousands of people were playing inside this game world with Azure scaling to meet it. Like ultimately, they just missed the actual high score, didn't they? They missed the number of people who were playing concurrently. I think mainly because marketing let us down a little bit. Sorry, developer marketing over here. But no,
I'm sure I'd moved on by then.
But it was more attracting people to come and play that was the problem. But the actual platform underneath it was absolutely rock solid, wasn't it?
It was amazing.
So when did you look at Elastacloud now, you see data science, and artificial intelligence. I mean, it's obviously, key now, but what was you've gone through this journey, if you like, through scaling of compute and learning about how to run Azure. What gets you into data?
That is a story.
Yeah, well, just to frame it, I'll let Rich tell the interesting story, which is painful. But I'll let Rich tell her story. Our approach to the cloud it's that fundamental do something useful with it kind of approach to it, right? A lot of people come to the cloud and just want to reproduce the exact same thing that they had on their own tin in their own service in the past. They want to lift and shift and ignore it, right? Just leave it there forever. And that approach, just to me and Rich, was always just totally wrong. It was never going to get the best out of the platform, and it was never going to get developers more productive and able to solve customer demands better. So, how do we do something new? Well, we use the cloud for what it's really good at: scaling, elasticity, infinite scale from the point of view of the consumer. All of these things are fundamentally transformational. We did a few things with high-performance compute, which is using loads of machines to solve big engineering challenges, math challenges. We did things with computational fluid dynamics, airflow around buildings and the construction, stuff like that. And it was all sort of interesting, but mathematical and kind of a small market really overall. It gets bigger as it goes, but there was this thing happening at the same time which dwarfed it, which was the big data revolution. And the big data revolution was sort of off the back of large-scale internet sites with huge log files that wanted to try and figure out what people were doing with their websites to try and make it better. And so at-scale compute to solve that was a natural thing. And the best thing from our perspective was that nobody already had an on-prem big data cluster because it was a brand new wave of tech. People already had on-prem high-performance compute clusters at universities and engineering orgs. They'd already made those investments. So getting them to throw that away and move to the cloud was a big challenge. And then along came this wave of technical innovation around big data, and no one had any investments to throw away. So it was brand new territory for us to move into. So we got pretty excited about that. And it was fun.
Yeah. I totally remember the entry point to that. It was when Microsoft released the Hadoop on Azure TAP, the technical access preview. And Andy, so I spent some of my career being like an N-tier developer. So I'd write data-driven applications. I knew how to write SQL well, design databases, operational databases, and write COM in C++, and using Microsoft Transaction Server and all of that kind of stack. That was relevant just before the time of .NET, and then kind of graduated into remoting, and so I was always into distributed computing and scale out. And it was mainly because I was working for a lot of city banks at the time, and that was what you needed, right? You needed to send messages all over the place, you needed to receive them, everything was pub sub. And I was never too au fait with building large-scale databases with lots of stored procedures, and you need to think like a certain way, like a DBA, right? And there was only that DBA delineation. There was never like a database developer. Now people call themselves these things because they're moving into big data, but it wasn't really a thing when I was working. And then Andy said, I've got access to this technical access preview, and we can scale these clusters of 3 machines, 3 nodes. And so we ran our first word count together. Yeah. Right. So
should have been called not very big data, shouldn't it?
I think we had War and Peace or Moby Dick or something, and we counted the number of words, and it was, I knew the MapReduce pattern, but to see it distributed was something else, right? And to begin to write C# code as well, which was what we knew to do this, was amazing. So Andy said, we got this opportunity with Asos, right? They're not having any transaction with their BI team, and they're in this court case challenge, and they had to try and prove that they weren't doing some kind of infringement with another company that was quite close to their name, like a letter or 2 out, and that web traffic wasn't being diverted. And ordinarily you can do this with web requests, but the problem with BI is that you've got a whole load of source data and you don't care about that, right? You get it into a form where you can build reports. So if you don't know in advance that you're interested in this, right, then you're not going to be able to report on it. And so Andy said, I think we can do this. And we called up we had to actually work with the Hadoop on Azure TAP team because you can only have these 3 nodes. And we said to Microsoft, can we have 500 of them for the weekend? and they gave us 500 nodes and worked with us. We wrote a C# program, and I remember I was checking in with Andy every now and again, but you were pretty much up for 36 hours straight.
It was a lot of fun.
And just to make sure that this cluster, which really had a lot of scale, could do what it needed to do. And come Monday morning, we gave the lawyers this big stack of reports that basically boiled down to, gave them all the evidence that they needed, but basically boiled down to some kind of numeric probability that I think maybe like 0.36% of people actually went to the wrong site, or it was even less than that.
Yeah, it was tiny.
And they had no other way at the time to prove technically that there was some kind of infringement.
So this got you into the big data then, and what was the thought process here? You thought, well, we've gone through the hard yards, 36 hours straight or whatever. We can take that skill forward, or was it slightly more serendipitous? Did somebody knock on the door the following day saying, I've got the same problem? How did you then develop it forward?
I think it was slow. We loved it, but there just weren't many opportunities. It was just too new and too new doing it in the cloud. People had really invested and were spending millions on all these on-premise big data platforms, and same as HPC, right? It was just emergent, but it wasn't really a thing to do in the cloud.
Yeah.
So
what about as you move forward into, leaping forward into where we are now, AI, but machine learning obviously has been around a long time. Were you getting into ML in that time as well?
Yeah, it was interesting because ML is it's just a technique really that gets applied across large amounts of data to train, and because we'd started moving into techniques to be able to handle a large amount of input data, it was a pretty natural thing for us to do. It was also software, right? So machine learning is really software to describe how to build a model that then can give you some recommendations effectively at the end. And to build it as software was, for a long time, was something most people just didn't get. Like data scientists wouldn't get. They'd think of it more as like little hacky scripts here and there. And we came at it with sort of huge amounts of computational resource and a rigor around software that meant that the quality was good as well, and we understood all the outputs. So we built some machine learning teams. We built some products around AI, like renewable energy and a few other pieces like that around electricity management. And we've carried on investing around sustainability and other things like that more recently. But when we came to tackle that problem around machine learning, we just thought we have all these tools in our arsenal, and using the cloud to sort of power all that, but they're not really worrying about the cloud part of it, building on top of abstraction, accepting the abstractions and working to the quality and the merit of the abstraction was how we sort of managed to achieve more than most people who got a bit too into the weeds with it. But I mean, we got into the weeds a few times. There was a point where because we got fed up with Hadoop, I mean, most people got fed up with Hadoop around the same time. It was sort of okay around reading text files off disk or off a distributed disk, but it would just forget about what it had read pretty much immediately. So if you had to read the same input file twice, it would have to do the same ingestion over and over again. And that was the slow part. So it would just be spinning these disks forever. And
I think it was designed off of my brain, maybe.
Perhaps, same as me. But the reason then that it became slow was around the model that had been used about accessing data, and the fact that when it was initially designed, storage disks were cheap, RAM was incredibly expensive, and network access across things wasn't very rapid, so you couldn't really read things particularly well. You had to go to a single disk local to the machine and read it all from there. And that was Hadoop's fundamental design, I/O partitioning, compute association with I/O on the same machine that the I/O is. And then this new wave came out, which went, well, actually, hardware technology has matured, and that means we have more RAM than we ever have. And network connections are now like gigabit speed commonly, and this was obviously quite a few years ago. But the rapidity with which you can request pieces of memory between machines was fast, and the size of memory you've got on each machine was also quite vast. So we then had this kind of ability to use different frameworks that were designed differently to how Hadoop was. And we started looking into things like Apache Spark. Before there was a Databricks, there was an Apache Spark, and we were first movers in running Spark on Azure. And we learned a lot about it, which I think ended up standing us in good stead.
Yeah.
The process of building it out on Azure was not so fun, though.
No, I totally love that time. I remember we were in very close contact with Microsoft, and Microsoft were investing so much money to make all of this stuff work on Windows. And you just kind of scratch your head and thought, well, why? Because you've got a Linux platform on Azure. And so what we decided to do was to take all of these distributed Apache stacks and make them work through a kind of marketplace on Azure. We were in really good contact with the engineering team at the time, and we showed them what they were doing, and they were like, oh, this is great. We're only interested in Windows, so we're not going to step on your toes. And we started reaching out to customers going, well, look at what we've done on Linux. And in one click, we had this deployment capability. We built this marketplace type thing so that you could install Apache Spark, Apache Storm, and it would take care of like all of the backbone of this. So like Databricks does today, but a little bit more abstract. But you didn't need to worry about infrastructure if you wanted to run this on Linux on Azure. So it was a first. We called this Brisk. Yeah, it was called Brisk. We spent a lot of time speaking to the engineering team because they were actually interested at one point in talking about buying the IP from us, which would have been amazing. But they were working very closely with Hortonworks at the time, and the kind of in thing was to think about like all of these big frameworks, which is what HD Insight eventually became. And so we had a small customer base, but we had a whole load of input into the community, and we started building communities around us with this. It led to the emergence of like the Azure user group became quite data focused.
Yeah, I mean, you really went heavy duty on communities. Why did you go there? I mean, obviously there's the Azure user group, the Essex user group, the Kent user group, the IoT community, etc. You've clearly got that as a key part of the Elastacloud DNA. Why did you go on that journey?
So for me personally, I didn't know what to do with all my spare time when I wanted to learn, and I thought I always want to be around like-minded people. So it was a natural step for me. But when I'm quite an introvert as a character, and when we started the Azure user group and we didn't have any speakers, I was forced to write talks, and it was really hard for me. And when you build content, you can either do it in two ways, right? You can either be incredibly polished and make the best slides and the best experience for all the people that you're presenting to, or you can be a little bit more of a hacker. And this is really the thing that Andy and I have got in common, right? We just never made the time to be polished. I'm not even sure how we would do that. There are a lot of people better at that than us. And we just sat in front of our laptops and wrote code in real time, and people were loving it. And I think at the time there was a whole generation there were a small group of people who would do these kinds of things on the user group circuit, and it was really inspiring for a lot of people. We were having like hundreds of people coming just literally to watch us code. It was so bizarre. And through it, we'd learn so many things, and I think when you're like that within a community of people and you're presenting back to them in a very, very human way, they get a very different picture of not being talked at, and it becomes a lot more participatory than...
I think the people that are really polished are people like me who've got no substance, and so we have to focus on that.
Whereas
the real people do the...
I really don't know about that. I remember sitting in hacks with you with the Barclays Ping It team and Lloyds Bank.
God, yeah. But all I was doing was getting the tea and biscuits. Come on, let's be real. But no, this is really, really important, because this community side of things, which I think you're absolutely right, and the whole hackathon piece, it is about a sort of a shared, massive learning experience from people that know. But bringing it back to machine learning and artificial intelligence, just wanted to, obviously we're all worrying about the way that artificial intelligence can dominate our lives, and that obviously we have to worry about bias. And of course, if we're all people like us who've grown up through this developer journey and are coding this stuff, do you see the risk that actually a lot of the, if you like, people like you are in charge of this? We're all very well-meaning, but where are we now with the diversity of thought and opinion and idea, geography, language that we've been talking about on this journey, that comes back into the way that artificial intelligence is developed, which is becoming so pervasive in our lives? Andy,
what deep question? You said you weren't going to go deep. It's a brilliant question, though, and I think maybe it's wrong to think about it just being a problem with AI. Right? And AI is just a more recent tool that has a lot of these problems, but a lot of the problems already existed beforehand. And I'd like to liken the use of AIs in certain scenarios, whether it's education, getting your final paper written by a bot effectively, or whether it's copywriting being done not by a person but by a machine, and how that might have a negative effect on people's ability to have a job. It's just the same as what always happens. There's always a tool that comes out that you can use, and if we just say, well, the tool knows how to do it, we'll let the tool do it, you're not going to end up with anything differentiated. You're not going to end up with anything special, right? AI is something at the moment that this generation of AI, generative AIs, will just create huge amounts of stuff that looks like it makes sense, but it'll have no depth or substance behind it. Absolutely nothing behind it. No actual innovation or creation. The thing that drives people and gets people together and makes people happy, in my experience, and the people that work at Elastacloud, like hacking together, starting with nothing and innovating together and going on the journey together as a team, where we all learn something together and end up at a place that probably none of us expected. The thing about AI stuff is that pretty much the output is what you expect. It might be accurate if it's seen something that it can describe in its training set. It might give you an accurate representation of that. But will it take you to somewhere slightly off-piste? Will it take you somewhere exciting, new, novel? Not really, not realistically, or just even in like the generative art things, they're just copies of other things that it's seen before in a style of another artist, you know, so it's not new or novel. And I guess what really drives us in Elastacloud is going to new places that stuff that's trained and only understands what it's been trained on can never get to, because they're always looking at how do I summarize the past, and we're not interested in that. We're looking about how do we build the future.
Can you not just sort of say, you know, Picasso plus Rembrandt and then add randomize or something, you know?
That still wouldn't be new, would it?
But isn't that really what humans quite often do? Do they just take actually patterns and then add a bit of magic? The magic is the random new thought associated with it.
That's true, but then the human who's saying add that and add that is doing the creative spark. The machine isn't doing the creative spark. And if the creative spark result is done by another tool, I don't actually have a problem with the tool itself. The tool is fine. In fact, we should be building those tools and embracing those tools. The creative spark in that scenario, Rembrandt plus Picasso, picture of a cat. I mean, it's probably going to be the most viral thing ever. Get a kitty by those guys on the net. That'd be amazing. But no, that creative thought to do it and what you do with it and how you present it and how you frame it and the sort of beauty of human understanding around the edges of that, that's actually something which didn't come from the tool itself. It was how the tool was used.
So, I mean, I really want to sort of drill in a bit on this, you know, this communities and the way that Elastacloud, you know, works in the way you've described. But I want to keep it in this area of technology because, you know, Gates was just interviewed. I don't know if you saw him on the BBC, and they were saying, you know, when you started, you know, what were you trying to do? And he said, obviously, we were trying to improve education and communication and, you know, human understanding, medicine, blah, blah, blah. And then the guy went on about social media and the divisions it's created and the politics problems it's created. And he went, I wasn't expecting that, you know, clearly. And he didn't quite know how to resolve it. If you think about where you are today with what we're talking about on artificial intelligence, you know, tools and weapons, you know, you're doing it all with a good, positive, creative intent. What can we be doing in, you know, powerhouses like Elastacloud to almost anticipate, you know, the misuse, so that we don't end up with some, you know, new dystopia. Again, a bit profound, but how do you guys think about these things other than I'm delivering the project for a customer?
So I think AI has had a really, really interesting genesis. Anybody that studied this academically, especially early on in the 90s, right? You had to differentiate between these things called strong and weak AI, and you know, you got a vision that strong AI was the Terminator, and weak AI was something that didn't quite pass the Turing test. And we've got to this stage in our history now where nobody even talks about the Turing test. And we, you know, I remember like literally everybody and their dog were trying to build an equivalent bot to just prove that it was a human. And it wasn't, you know, every single time it would fail with something or some expression would come back that wasn't quite human enough. But we don't seem to have a problem evaluating that, and we haven't really raised the bar of the Turing test, right? It's just, you know, it's just something that can be done now. I guess one of the things that I'm really interested in is where those dividing lines are, because I guess as Andy said, right, we're used to using tools to fulfill a particular function, and then you've got all these incredible cloud vendors that are bringing out like the amazing part of AI, which is this general understanding and recognition of people, right? So that you can look at a scene and go, that person's in their 40s, that person's in their 30s, that's a man, that's a woman, that's a child. But a lot of that stuff has been done now. And, you know, one of the things that we're finding is that to move to the next level, right, we're having to spend more and more money on compute to up our game. And the way that I think about this is like, because ChatGPT, OpenAI is the talk of everything now, of our industry. But it's also costing, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars to train these models, right? And the next model will cost $500 million, and the model after that too, because this is how we're going to grow. And it kind of, the parallel for me is, is to try to understand what the incremental gain is, because that's the way that the market's moving. And in my mind, I really liken this to things like CERN and particle accelerators, where you have to build something bigger and bigger for smaller pieces of incremental gain. So in my mind, I'm not sure that the direction that we've got at the moment is going to give us the big bang that everybody's looking for, because there's going to come a point where training all these incredible models, and I think like a couple of years ago it was Res or res-kit for Microsoft, and then Google
it's
had
not
their
a Moore's
own
law. It doesn't just kind of infinitely keep, improving
I
and
think
getting
so.
cheaper.
I think we're getting diminishing marginal returns for this, if I'm being honest.
Yeah. Interesting. And then, so, bringing that back to the team, Elastacloud, you've got a very diverse team. You've got, Spain, you've got, India, you got all the language piece, but also, you love your gaming and, all this sort of stuff. How did that culture that you're breeding at Elastacloud come about? And do you actively do that, or is that just kind of a, byproduct of who you are?
Oh yeah, I think it is a bit of a byproduct of who we are. We unfortunately all went through the lockdown relatively recently, and we had to find ways of building a team that felt like it was a team, despite the fact there was distance between all of us. And previously we'd had offices around London and around the world, and no one was going there anymore. So no one got to meet their teammates, no one got to hang out for a coffee or a beer or whatever it was. And so the sort of closeness of the team felt like it was just degrading a little bit over time. I think everyone felt the same thing, but I guess what we did that was maybe a little bit different was we embraced remote technologies to actually bring people back together. And we did things like pub quizzes, we did online gaming, and we actually built a reasonable community of colleagues who were friends and were hanging out when they couldn't really hang out with anybody else. And it was, a real lifeline during that period. And when it started coming to an end, we wanted to double down on some of that. So, we'd started doing some Dungeons and Dragons remotely. And when people were starting to go back to the office and had less time in the evenings and less time because of commuting and things like that, we thought it'd be a bit of a shame to actually lose that, because we realized that when it got a little bit quieter, when the dust settled a little bit during lockdown, it was like, this is a really good and healthy way to bring people together, to get them to move out of who they are or the problems that they're facing day to day with their work or with their personal lives, embody something else, and just come together to work on as a team to sort of achieve amazing things. So, we appointed a in-house dungeon master, and we have lots of games and esports and all kinds of stuff now, don't we?
Yeah,
that's right.
I think it's interesting that, there's a lot of people who I know of my generation sort of go, I've got to get everybody back in the office because there's no way that it works remotely. And then, there's people like, obviously I was brought up in a pretty much remote working world through Microsoft, and you've had this very positive experience. If we switch gears slightly, you're going into businesses, who've got a paradigm, that's a paradigm, right? You've got to be in the office to work, but they've got a paradigm of how to run their computing and so forth, how do their e-commerce. And you've got a bit of a reputation for sort of saying, no, don't do it that way. Do it this alternative way, or you're doing it wrong. What gave you the confidence to sort of say to big corporates, big powerful people, you're doing it wrong?
Just frustration, to be honest. I think after one of the problems is that people want to talk about the way that you do things, and then that dominates the conversation for weeks. And if you're somebody who gets itchy fingers, right, and just wants to write code and do stuff, right, you can get lulled into this cycle of, which is a very, very enterprise cycle of talking things to death, right? Looking at all the permutations, and it's always zero sum, right? So one of the things that we've done from large customers to small customers is just go around their constraints and just get into a position where we've gone away, done something, and then had a show and tell, and they've gone, what? You did this in like a week or 2 weeks. And I think fundamentally, because that was what Andy and I always did to get business, because we'd listen to what people wanted. We'd think sometimes, oh, that's a really stupid way of doing something. Then we'd go away and show them how we would do it, and they were blown away. And so the culture in Elastacloud has developed around that, around this like central idea of a hack, I think. In enterprises, hack is a dirty word. People call it accelerator or accelerator time or anything to avoid, you hacking stuff together. But I mean, I don't see why. The Bill Gates, Steve Wozniak, they were the original hackers. This is what these guys were called. Surely you want to emulate the best, right?
Yeah. Well, you've described, over this podcast, you've kind of, you hacked your career and your business together very successfully. So, it's a very successful approach. But do you find, Andy, when you're standing there in front of, these established mindsets and paradigms, and you're saying, let's hack our way to show you something different, are people resistant to that, the regulation and compliance people, or are people, is that changing now? The sort of scales falling off the eyes and people starting to embrace this approach more?
Well, I think that
be honest, Andy.
People don't like change, but now more than ever, it's easier to explain to people why change is necessary and why some of the thinking that people are stuck in is so completely obsolete. So you've got people in financial services who insist that you come into the office wearing smart attire. You must be there 5 days a week, 9 to 5. At the same time that their core business is shutting down its branches because they don't talk to people face to face anymore. So you never meet a customer in head office anyway, and even their branches never really meet customers anymore. In e-commerce, you never meet your customers. One of the reasons AI exists in e-com is because you have to try and figure stuff out about people that you never get to meet and ask direct questions. So if you never meet a customer, who are you trying to impress, right? If you're just trying to get your work done, following that thought process, the computer doesn't care where you are, right? The computer doesn't care a lot about it. They're cruel beasts, and they don't care who you are. And this is actually why they're quite a great leveler. They don't care your gender, they don't care your age, they don't care your race, they don't care anything at all about you. They are completely agnostic to who is programming the computer. They're also agnostic to who is uploading the web package, where you're doing that from. They're the people who are submitting the job on a Spark cluster. They don't care. The computer doesn't care where that's coming from. It just has to go and get its job done. So when you think about the work that needs to get done in the modern world, particularly when the cloud is involved, location isn't really a factor that's important to try and achieve it. And you start thinking about, why did people think it was? Well, part of the reason was to have a culture where it was visible that there was an empire, therefore this company is successful. That used to be a factor. That's not really a factor anymore. People don't really think about it like that anymore. People just look at it and go, that's a massive cost of this huge office somewhere in London. Why are you doing it? And also there used to be this thing that culture needed to be done by the water cooler. But culture by the water cooler is an archaic sort of thought process, because everyone spends their time on Teams call anyway, right? Everyone is constantly collaborating digitally and virtually with people all around the world. And that actually makes us more effective, because if I need to talk to someone who's a specialist, I want to get hold of that specialist, and they happen to be in Spain, I can't go and chat to them at the water cooler, right? So I have to do something remote anyway. So a team of great brains that's distributed globally will fundamentally have a virtual basis to it. And if it's going to have a virtual basis to it, and I'm going to spend most of my time talking to my friends who are in Almeria or in Malaga or in Nottingham, I'm going to spend time talking and working with those guys, then being in London versus being where I'm from, which is in Kent, doesn't make any difference to the actual outcome of that. And all that happens to actually change my working environment is I go from one desk to another desk. But to get to the other desk in central London, I have to spend money on a train. I have to emit carbon to get there. I have to go through the personal stress of showering. No, that's
okay, like once a month.
Every so often. If you just brush your hair and put the blurred background on, it's okay. It's fine. They can't see. But the reality though is that actually being virtual allows you to focus on the work that needs to be done. Modern work doesn't really care so much about where you are. The thinking process around the edges of having to have an office and having to be there so we can show you off is just archaic. It doesn't really work anymore. And there are better ways of collaborating. If we're goal-orientated and we're digitally mediated, we actually have a better overall productivity outcome. And that's really what we're after. And the cloud and tech overall is sort of about the process from a personal experience, but from a business experience, it's not really about the journey, it's about the outcome.
Yeah. Now, I mean, as a sort of counterpoint, obviously let's move on to sustainability, which is obviously, the word of the moment, obviously something you've been very focused on over the last couple of years. But the counterpoint to what you've just said, some would say, price reduction, people's jobs being diminished, globalization, anxiety created by, being absent from a community, etc., are some of the great problems of our time. And that place does matter. It matters in biodiversity, because obviously biodiversity lives in a place. Carbon, not so much. It's obviously global. But the product of everything we do is about a community. Now, that would mean for many people community as it was in the 18th, 19th century. I think what you've described is community as it can be in a modern world. And so it seems to me that's more about the execution of the way you manage and operate a business. It's not it's not tools. It's how you work with that. Do you see where I'm going with that? What's the response?
Absolutely. Isolation and a feeling of not being part of a tribe is a terrible thing for emotional, mental well-being for humans. We're social creatures. So that's why we did things like having in-house dungeon masters and building things around the outsides of work to support people to build something that's collaborative and social as part of the work experience. I think that you're absolutely spot on with that. The origin of what people think of as a community, and it is just centuries outdated. It's centuries old. Probably never existed either, because this is the way that these sort of things happen, hand-me-down stories and memories of golden times that never actually happened. And the reality is that if we look at what we're doing in Elastacloud, I think we have a lot of very happy people who enjoy working together, who enjoy the social parts of it, enjoy the journey that we're going to together. And there's no way you could actually get a lot of those people in the same place, because there are visa problems with having people from different countries being in the same place. There are people who are genuinely friends who want to spend time together, and the only real way they can achieve that is by being online. And that's actually a modern reality. I think that the idea that nations and country borders are actually that relevant for people is actually archaic itself. And I actually think that there's a new supranational humanity arising of like-minded people who enjoy like things, and they aren't in the same country. They don't happen to be born in the same place. And in fact, the people that they surround themselves with is more happenstance, circumstance, and the people they choose to surround themselves with are global, and they meet online, and they play games together, and they work together, and they do things that otherwise would be impossible if they went down to the job center in the local village and said, right, web developer, here we go. There wouldn't be any jobs.
Yeah. And so it's still true that it takes a village, if that old metaphor, to get something done. But what you've described is people rolling up their sleeves, helping each other, working together, but doing it digitally.
It's a digital
There
village.
is a place, obviously, for that physical conversation, which is partly why we're here today. We could have done it digitally, but seeing your eye reactions and your body reactions and things it's slightly it's more nuanced, isn't it?
And we do things where we meet up, and we travel, and people travel to come and see us, and we've helped people move to the UK from various different places. We've supported people to do those sort of things because physical proximity is important.
But it's not the be all and end all. But sustainability, I really wanted to drill on you on sustainability, because where does that come from? Because it's a deep-seated commitment to life commitment to this thing that you're doing, isn't it? Really.
So I think I've got to credit our because we've gone through a few stages with what we class as sustainability, but the whole our whole modern perspective around ESG and Scope 3 and carbon accounting is probably entirely down to you for the Sustainable Finance Live. I think that for me, when I attended that for the first time, it pushed so many buttons for me, right? And because I've got a certain kind of set of values.
That's what I'm thinking about more than an event that I put on, which I'm sure is you've overstated. But it's where does it come from in who you are in your life, in your childhood, that made you those things light up, if you will, on that day?
So I think it's probably worth going back in time a bit. I know earlier in the conversation we mentioned renewables. It's something we discovered about 5 or 6 years ago, and we hadn't had any exposure to the energy markets then. Principally, we had, and I personally had some exposure to oil and gas, and I think one of the things that became really, really clear was that even though it was a fairly mature market, right? People build solar farms, they build wind turbines, they connect them to the grid, they get energy, right? A lot of consumers know that this is a good thing and they should be consuming this, even if the price differentials are slightly more than burning coal. One of the things that we found is that the market itself just wasn't ready for any of the kind of technology that we were bringing to this. And we designed an algorithm, a dark sky algorithm, for example, to predict solar irradiance to an accuracy that no other prediction engines had seen. And we tried to market this. There was a huge amount of interest. We spoke to funds that owned solar. We spoke to some of the big solar asset managers and asset owners, and everybody could see value in what we wanted, in what we were showing them, and that was a really, really strong foray for us with a large team in data science. Microsoft did a whole case study on this. And we absolutely loved doing it because it really kind of showcased how you could use data to do something better than you have now. But the market economics just weren't in our favor. We got to understand that banks weren't interested in having any kind of risk, even if it was more measured, because you had better algorithms to predict stuff and that they could potentially make more money. All they were interested in was like offloading all their risk to someone else. Mm-hmm. And the people that were dealing with the risk, we couldn't really have smart conversations with them, right? Even though some of them actually had smartest or smart in their company name, which was quite ironic. But we just ran out of people to talk to, right? And everybody was going, "Oh, that's brilliant, and that's the future." And we're like, "No, it's the now. We've built this, right? You can make more money from understanding how to sell this and at what times, because we can predict and forecast how much solar is being generated, rather than you having a stable power purchase agreement and actually throwing energy away, right? It's like when you learn this fact that the grid is only so big and you've got all of this encouragement to build solar farms, wind turbines, hydro, and then you learn that a certain proportion of this just has to be thrown away. Yeah. It's actually quite soul destroying because you got all these conflicting messages. So I think these are the kind of problems that we wanted to solve and make better. And when I discovered sustainable finance, right, the ability to drive investment decisions through data so that you could change the kind of scenarios that we got to by greater education, more awareness, and people understanding that very, very small movements. And as you know, we've discussed the Murphy project, which we're going to be talking about soon. And this is case in point. It's the proposition was to look at a supply chain of suppliers who are supplying aggregates, who are supplying steels, and understand what impact they're really having on the environment. And it's almost like a eureka moment when you begin to surface this stuff and you go, "Oh, I didn't know so-and-so Limited was doing that," or they were based in an ecological zone that was, that's off limits, and if you've got an awareness of this, especially with all the pressure from shareholders and investors these days, and also consumers, right, you're going to do something about it. So I think certainly for us, right, and I think with technology, we've always wanted to be impactful, but just being able to take that and having a societal impact, well, I think Elastacloud is at that point now where it can, I was going to say tech for good, but it is actually tech for good. It's tech for commercial and consumer good, right? Because you have to help build these constraints, right? Everybody's talking about this new world, but I feel like it's emerging now, right? And now is the time to be able to use data, big data, the sorts of machine learning technologies that we're
so you're at the sort of peak of your powers. Then you've kind of gone through these learnings about scale and about data. You're applying it now, seeing an impact, not necessarily just in e-commerce, but in something which is got a planetary impact. You've also got a series of crises which have happened, which are the biggest change agents, aren't they, really, in society, such as COVID and the energy crisis. What, Andy, from your perspective, what's next for you and Elastacloud, given all of those those conditions?
Yeah, so I think we've spent quite a few years now working for other people on other people's big ideas, and I'd really like this to be this next period for us to start working on our own big ideas, whether they're new products, new software products, or new ways, new approaches within the consultancy to take people to the next level. That is what I'd like us to do, to find our voice and start talking about ourselves and less about the fundamental technology underpinnings of what we do, the how we do stuff, but more the outcome, why people use the end result. There's a few things that we're already doing that look like that. We talked about sustainability. We've got some great stuff that we've built in there already. I spent a lot of my time building a piece of software called Intelligent Spaces. It's a wonderful piece of software that takes representations of 3D space of buildings and makes them smart, makes them intelligent. And I like to think of it as the computer from the USS Enterprise, one of the Star Trek like starships. And if you've watched any of that, then you can ask the computer, just voice activated, like where's the sick bay, where is somebody in the building, and it will sort of show you the way there. It's a definition of the space. And I told you I was into sci-fi earlier, and it's a view of the future where basic services are ubiquitous, right? So you're in a space and it's by default a smart space. It's intelligent. The computer system that operates it isn't something sat down in the basement that effectively can just turn the heating on or off, and that's all it can do. And it's, on a timer, and it's got some kind of primitive chip in it. If you think about how everything's going, those primitive chips will burn out one day and will be replaced by a smart chip everywhere in every building. And there'll be a gradual move towards smarter and smarter and more capable control systems in every space, in every building that anybody has. And someone's got to build the hyper-intelligent computer that controls all that. And that's going to be us.
And do you think it will go further? I mean, we talk about, digital twin of the planet. So not just, the built environment, but also using satellites and sensors to actually see what's going on in the rainforests. Can you see a vision for that?
Yeah, definitely. So there's definitely some traction in that, so a direction of travel there where the type of data technology used that underpins it is effectively a graph database. It lets you treat relationships just as important as the things that have the relationships. So in a typical world from when we're from, SQL and SQL Server and relational database models where you've got relationships between stuff, but it just says that links to that and that's it. Whereas in a graph world, you've got a person and a person, you've got friend as a relationship between them. But that can also have properties. It can be, friend for how long, for how many years, when did you first meet? And you can start having these really complicated relationships and friends of friends, and that's the typical example. But you can actually then start interconnecting every piece of data that you've got in the world. and breaking down silos. And silos are one of the things that stops innovation, because a silo of the data is the end of your database. It's when you get to the end of your database and you've got nothing else to read. It's in another database, you have to go over there. And these graph databases are wonderful at letting you not have an endpoint. They let you sort of connect things that are disparate and break down the silo between two sets by saying, this is how their relationship looks, this is how you can query them. And then you can traverse them across the board to come up with things that say, not only am I a building, but I am a building in a location, and the people who are coming to it are using these types of transport system. And those transport systems are burning these fuels, and these fuels come from these locations. And when you start being able to describe that by relating things together in very complicated ways, you start being able to model it. And the computational effort required to do that is still currently prohibitive. But the way that we can start to build twins that link smaller versions of that together, but treat the links as just as important as the individual data sets so that we can traverse them, that's how we'll ultimately build that world-spanning computer. It'll be about the relationships between things and not necessarily the things themselves.
And is that a computer in the sense of a cloud owned by somebody, or is that a distributed open source set of things which are just being connected together depending on many different circumstances?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I don't think that if it sits inside a single cloud, I think it'll be effective. I don't think it would work. No. I think that you already see people with at scale data challenges giving up on the idea that having a vendor tie-in is actually helpful, and they use the best tool for the job wherever they are for whatever they're doing. And for this type of problem domain, I think you need to abstract the provider away and sit a tier above that, a digital twin over the top of all the individual sources of data.
Yeah, cool. And Richard, same question for you. I mean, again, you've been on this journey and you've got this vision. Where do you see the world going over the next few years for you in Elastacloud?
So I think one of the things that I've seen is that the cadence of technology in the cloud, especially over the last few years, has just improved tremendously. Right, you can build data governance solutions now, and you couldn't do 2 years ago. And it might seem simple when you look from the top down, but there's a whole load of problems in the detail. I think what's going to happen is, because I see a company like Elastacloud as really good at filling in the gaps that Microsoft has. We're not the kind of company that do the rinse and repeat stuff, right? So the building the data lake and populating it and going through the ingestion, it doesn't really suit us as a business. We're still at the cutting edge. And so I think the technologies are becoming more and more standardized. And this is why I feel like it's, now is a transition time for us. And as Andy said, it's, we've had a great one with Microsoft. They're our fantastic partner, and we are totally dedicated to using Azure. We've built a company that has got 250 plus Azure experts. But I think now it's about us building that higher value on Azure. So, what is the software that we can bring to customers that will really shortcut their journey so that they can skip steps 1, 2, and 3? And up until now, it's been us doing steps 1, 2, and 3 in a very bespoke way. And it hasn't been a straight arrow for us or our customers. They've generally, customers will change their plans through as they learn things. You'll have to go on a journey with them to teach them all the things that you've learned over the past decade. Yeah. So I think being able to shortcut some of these things is where we want to be. And we've created some incredible accelerators like Data Platform in a Box, where you just press a button, within 17 minutes, you've got a data platform. We're doing the same for things like data meshes and data governance frameworks, because these are all things that have been done, right? Microsoft's proved that you can put the building blocks together, and you've still got a whole load of consultancies that are making money from customers over putting these building blocks together. Why? It's the same as we were talking about with generalizable AI, right? Why would you write an image recognition algorithm again, given that Microsoft has done it? So I think that we're getting much more commoditized about the basic things so that we can really bring that value. And I see us very much in a solution transition to begin to understand what value actually is for customers, because it's not deploying an Azure service, it's not building a data mesh, right? It's there are better not worse, but different consultancies that can do that kind of thing. We want to build the thing at the end where the CEO or the CTO or just goes, wow, this has changed my entire thinking. And we've had a string of customers where just listening to some of the C-suites who've seen reports from the automotive industry and the aeronautics industry, and I've been in these meetings where they've had these wow moments, and it's absolutely amazing, right? To think that we started with nothing a few months ago, and here we are now, and somebody's got value, but they've continued using it for years on end, and there's actually been a point of inflection in the business, So I think being able to do that but commoditize it more is where we're heading.